Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
You made this very interesting comparison between Narendra Modi and Erdogan. So where are you coming from, and will you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. First of all, Shekhar, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure actually taking a break from my boring routine where I never leave the house. But on the column, so I just started initially just by noticing, as one does if you read the foreign pages of the newspapers, these two stories which were happening within a couple of weeks of each other. The Erdogan turning the Hagia Sophia back into a mosque, and Modi and Ayodhya, and what was going on there. And it seemed to me that there was a certain similarity, at least outwardly. But then when I sort of dug into it, it seemed to me that the broader project that both men both leaders are doing have similarities in the sense that they're both uneasy with, and some would say, in a mild sense, at war with the kind of secular foundations of the states that they inherited or that they became leaders of. So that, to take the Turkish case, Turkey is founded, but the Turkish Republic was founded by Ataturk, who very much wanted to turn Turkey into a secular state. It was him that turned the Hagia Sophia into a museum. And Erdogan came up in the same way that Modi came up through Hindu nationalism and Hindutva and all that. Erdogan came up through an Islamist political party, which was at war with the country's establishment. They actually saw the Hagia Sophia moment as less important than some other things that Erdogan has done, for example, to the changes to universities, changes to rules around alcohol, etc., etc. But nonetheless, it's part of a process of turning Turkey back into a much more self-consciously Islamic state. And it seems to me that there are strong parallels with what Modi is doing in India, where, again, he's saying not that comfortable. The people around him are saying they're not comfortable with the secular legacy. India has to be much more overtly a Hindu country. And so the symbolism of these two things happening within weeks of each other, Ataturk, what he represented in a way, or the assault on the sort of Ataturk legacy. And I think they're careful about it in the same way that Modi is careful in the way he talks about Nehru and Gandhi. I don't think Erdogan will actually disrespect Ataturk by name directly, but his followers certainly will. And there'll be people who put out the idea that, well, Ataturk was, had betrayed parts of the heritage of Turkey. But often it'll be done in sort of code or indirectly or by supporters rather than directly by the leader himself.
And it's a bit like that with, say, Gandhi in India or Nehru in India.
Yeah, that's my feeling. I mean, you know the country obviously far better than I do, but I remember, in fact, last time I was in Delhi where we were talking about this, and you said that a lot of the more radical messages were put out not directly by Modi himself, but as you put it, I think, he doesn't say these things. He just has selfies taken with people who do. And I think that's sort of, I mean, actually Erdogan is a much less controlled figure in his rhetoric than Modi. He is given to big conspiracy theories to say that people in the West want to kill Turks and so on. In that sense, he's less controlled. But I think his relationship to the secular legacy, where he is clearly undermining it, but equally not prepared yet to say that Ataturk was a bad guy, not directly, not himself. I mean, I think, unavoidably the most important things are happening in the biggest countries, because they're the countries that people sort of fix their place in the world around. So what happens in the United States in the election, I think, is absolutely fundamental. Firstly, because in strategic terms, but also because of what America represents. So that in strategic terms, I think if Trump were to be reelected, you would see a further estrangement between the United States and the European Union, and possibly an intensification even more of this kind of rivalry with China, although some of that I think is for electoral purposes, but Trump does seem to have got the bit between his teeth on that issue. But I think also important America would lose a lot of what Joe Nye calls soft power, this ability to attract, to say the reason you should be on the American side in any global conflict is not just because we're rich and powerful, but also because we represent a more attractive model, an open society, open to the outside world. When you look at the way that Trump is cracking down on immigration, those kinds of soft power aspects of the United States, I think, have already been diminished by Trump. But I think if he were reelected, it would be even worse. I think actually, as far as India is concerned, it's probably a country which is less likely to be affected by the change, because I think for strategic reasons, successive American presidents, Bush and Obama, now Trump, and then Biden, if it is Biden, will see India as absolutely critical as a counterweight to China. So I think the Indian position would be less directly affected in strategic terms. So I think things like immigration would be importantly affected. The China thing, I think that you mentioned, it is intriguing, these stories that you refer to about dissent within the Communist Party, but frankly, it's so hard to know how broadly it goes, because it's a closed society. So, I know, or I've met some of these kind of brave academics who stick their heads above the parapets and who are destroyed, if they go against the party. I suspect that probably there's a lot of people who quietly admire them, but it's also my impression that China is, after 20, 30 years of indoctrination through the school system and other things, a highly nationalistic society. So there may be strong support for Xi as well. And I think one of the dangers is that to the extent that Xi is in trouble domestically, the incentive for him to have confrontations internationally, for example, over Taiwan, which are unifying issues, or indeed with India, rises. So China, even if it is unstable domestically, may become harder to deal with internationally. I think that the breakdown in the US-Chinese relationship will have implications for everybody, because the whole system of economic globalization has been built around the US-Chinese relationship, if you like. It's the most important economic relationship in the world. The Apple iPhone that I'm waving at you is an American product made there, etc. And that's just a single symbolic example. Now, if the two countries try and cut ties, we're all affected, because suddenly we may be subject to American sanctions if we do business with China, or the Chinese may punish us, by, trying to shut out Indian or British companies in China if you're seen to be moving towards America. So it will become a much more bifurcated world, and a world in which I think globalization, certainly as we've got used to it, begins to go into reverse.
Gideon, how much of this tension this breakdown between US and China, as you said, that is the central thing right now. How much of that is for real, and how much of it is WWE on the eve of elections in America?
That's a big question. I don't think we can be totally sure. To be honest, I don't think even Trump knows. He's a very volatile guy. And I think that his playbook was fairly clear until COVID hit, which was to have a row with China, get a trade deal in time to boost the economy ahead of the election, and then say, look how tough I am. I've been a great trade deal maker. But I think post-COVID, he's looking around for other ways of winning the election, to put it bluntly, and running against China makes sense. So that suggests that maybe it is a kind of electoral thing. But I think set against that is the fact that there are a lot of people around Trump, Peter Navarro, the trade guy, Matt Pottinger, who's the deputy national security advisor, who's a China expert, who have been waiting a long time for an opportunity to really fundamentally change the US-China relationship, who believe that America basically made a mistake 40 years ago when it opened up to China. Indeed, Mike Pompeo more or less said the same thing when he gave a speech about Henry Kissinger and Nixon's opening, where he said, we got it wrong. So I think that that group that really wants to change things is very powerful and are now making changes that may be quite hard to reverse. And I think the other thing to note is that this isn't just a Republican Party thing. So that, for example, there was a bill that went before the Senate in May saying that Chinese companies would be forced to delist from the New York Stock Exchange unless they opened their books to American regulators. Now, you would think that that would be kind of unpopular with very influential group, Wall Street banks, which make a lot of money by launching Chinese companies in America. But actually, it passed unanimously in the Senate, which tells you that a lot of Democrats, as well, all Democrats in this case, were in line with this, which again tells you that the notion of a China threat is very strong now in America, and it was closely associated with the opening of China. I think what has been a disappointment is the hope that China, the Communist Party, would cede power and that China would become a more open society. And people clung to that hope probably too long. And then I think with the coming of Xi Jinping in 2012, we've seen that it's actually not only not opening up, it's becoming more closed. Right. And somebody who, at least until COVID struck, used to go to China at least once a year. And so you can see the kinds of conversations that used to have changing. So I remember, maybe 6-7 years ago, going out with a bunch of Chinese academics to a dinner in a restaurant in Beijing. And they were prepared, they were members of the same university, but they were prepared to have an open discussion in front of a foreigner in a public place about whether China should become a democracy. And it was a very passionate, open, interesting thing to see. Some people said, no, that would be a terrible error, but there were other people who were saying, absolutely, we've got to end one-party rule. Now, that discussion would never take place now. Nobody would dare to do that. And that, I think, is a sign of how things have tightened up in a very regressive and regrettable way. Was it inevitable? No. I mean, I don't think it's... I think we were naive about thinking that China would change, but I don't think it had to go backwards in the way that Xi Jinping has. That could just be a kind of accident of Chinese politics, but it makes China a more threatening place, I think, because it's tied up with nationalism. And it also, you think suddenly as a Westerner, if this country is going to become the most powerful country in the world and begins to export its model in the way that the United States has when it was the most powerful country in the world, then that is a very bleak prospect for all of us. I mean, the Chinese will say, oh, well, we don't do that. We're not kind of a universalists like the Americans. But actually, they do it. I mean, you can see it in the way in which they try to control speech in foreign countries so that, we are not allowed, as far as they're concerned, to talk about the Uyghurs, to say that, well, maybe Taiwan should be an independent country.
Now, do you think it is this same nationalism or the use of the nationalism to distract attention? What is driving the Chinese into this new conflict with India, which didn't have to happen?
Yeah, I think that's almost the single most incomprehensible Chinese action, because why do it? They've got enough troubles, they've got the South China Sea, they've got this historic conflict that they claim they want to settle with Taiwan. They've got the world on their back over Xinjiang. This border dispute's been going for decades. To try to push it so aggressively that you kill Indian soldiers, and it seems to me, again, you're there, I'm not, but the potentially risk a permanent shift in Indian opinion to viewing China as an adversary, pushing India much closer to the Quad, something that India had been, quite careful about how closely it was going to get involved with all this, beginning to damage China, the market share of major Chinese companies in this huge market next door to them. It's madness. I mean, just on a strategic level, although Biden would represent continuity from the Obama years in some senses, a lot of the people around him making foreign policy would be the same people. People like sort of Jake Sullivan and Tom Donilon and would be tipped, maybe even Susan Rice as Secretary of State, would be tipped to come back. But they would find a world that had changed fundamentally. A more powerful China, a weakened America, a European Union that's breaking up, or that at least Britain has left. Modi very well entrenched in power in India. And then so I think they would have to start again. They couldn't just say, okay, let's just pick up where we left off. They'd have to make some kind of assessment of, well, what is this world that we face now? I think that they would start by doing quite conventional things like trying to rebuild America's alliances. But they would quite quickly face whole new challenges. Indeed, I think, climate, which Obama tried to make a central thing, is feeling increasingly urgent now. And I suspect that would be a big approach. But I think maybe the last thing, actually, and beyond, is that even though we regard Trump as some kind of crazy outlier, or most people I know do, actually he may have brought about two very consequential changes that last. The first is this shift in attitude towards China, which I think will last. And the second is a much, much more skeptical attitude to globalization.
A Biden-Kamala Harris administration, how do you see them relating to Modi?
Look, hard to know. I mean, I don't know what Kamala Harris thinks about Hindu nationalism or about the controversies around, is India becoming more authoritarian under Modi? I mean, there have been a few small things, like when I gathered that when the Foreign Minister Jaishankar addressed people in Congress and attempted to exclude Indian American Congresswoman who was a critic of Modi's, that Kamala Harris was upset about that. But that might just be solidarity towards a colleague. Difficult to tell. I mean, her record suggests she's a deeply pragmatic person. That she has been at times on the progressive left-wing wing. Then she was a prosecutor who was putting people into prison and doing things the left hate. She was a deep critic of Biden, really slammed Biden in the primaries. Now she's his running mate. So, I suspect she's a fairly adaptable person, and that she will look at America's strategic interests. And as I said before, successive presidents have come to the conclusion that India is crucial. I think the one difference, perhaps, is that because of her background, she will have a much more nuanced and deep understanding of India than anyone who's been in that position of power before. She'll have lines open to India that other American politicians didn't have.